This morning, we're wrapping up our journey through the book of Genesis. And Genesis has been a really interesting book for us to spend time in. I know that there's a lot of things that this time as I've read through Genesis that I've seen that I haven't seen in the past, and I hope that's been the case for you as well. But as we wrap up the book of Genesis, we read this week this journey from Canaan to Egypt. And actually this morning in our reading, we started reading the book of Exodus. Now, as we've read through Genesis, I've made it a point, I think every week, to mention that the original audience of the Genesis story would have been those who were coming out of slavery in Exodus. They were the ones who were hearing this story, and they needed to hear this story. There were pieces that they knew of their story, of the God story, but there's a lot that they didn't know. And so Genesis filled in the gaps in a way that God wanted his people to understand versus what they had learned in slavery in Egypt. So we've been thinking about the Exodus experience as we've read through the book of Genesis. And you can't really understand Genesis well without understanding the context in which it would have been understood. That is the Exodus. But now we're starting the book of Exodus. And it's this reciprocal relationship. You can't understand Exodus if you don't understand the Genesis story. And you can't understand Genesis well unless you understand the Exodus story. Especially what we're reading this week. Throughout the book of Genesis, we've heard this phrase, the land that I am giving to you and to your descendants. God promised that to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. He reiterated it to Joseph. But now as we come to the conclusion of the book of Genesis, all of a sudden they're leaving the land that God has promised them, and they're going to that land that is so full of other gods. They're going to Egypt. In the last several weeks, we've studied the story of Joseph. And I'll be honest with you, every time I read this story, when we get to this point in the story, I get so excited because I know that God is working in ways to help the Israelites be saved from the famine that's coming. And I see all of that coming together in my head, and I get excited. And I miss, but they're leaving where they're supposed to be. Now, we've spent the last few weeks with Joseph. And Joseph went through some rough stuff. And he deserved some of it. He was a little bit of a scoundrel. He was a little bit of a jerk in the way that he interacted with his brothers. And he deserved some of what he got. But the point that we have to keep in mind is that God was using all that Joseph went through to bring about a plan that was bigger than anything Joseph could get his arms around. At the end of the Joseph story, or the climax of it, Joseph goes from being an assistant in prison to being second in command in Egypt. And if you read it, he actually is in charge. Pharaoh just retains the title and the privileges, but he gives all control to Joseph. And in this position, Joseph is really a hero. His plan to stockpile grain in the midst of years of abundance kept many people alive in the famine that followed. He ended up helping Pharaoh to own most of Egypt. Pharaoh loved this plan. It's kind of corrupt as we think about it today. It's like, wait a second, it was their grain that they were growing in the first place that they stockpiled, and now they have to sell everything that they have and themselves in addition. But he was a hero in the moment. There's also a mention there in the text of an unreasonable tax that, well, it seemed unreasonable in some ways, but it seems kind of generous compared to what we pay. Where a fifth of everything that you own goes to Pharaoh every year. Sometimes I wish that was all we had to pay. But at the time, the people were excited for food. they were excited to get food when there was none to be found in their lands. Pharaoh was amazed at how good this famine was for Egypt. Now, famines aren't typically good for a nation, but for Egypt, Pharaoh turned out looking pretty good because of Joseph. And Joseph was a hero. Now, we've read the story of Joseph's brothers coming to buy food and how Joseph interacted with them. His humanity came through. He could not hide what he had been trying to hide, the emotions that were so deep within him. Even though he named his son saying, "I have forgotten," he couldn't forget. And that humanity came through, that emotion came through when Joseph saw his brothers. But as the story unfolds, Joseph is reunited with his family. He acknowledges who he is. And everything comes back together. Joseph sends for his dad and the rest of his family, says, "Come and live with me in Egypt. I will make provision for you." So Pharaoh, who really, Joseph is his golden boy, Pharaoh sends a caravan to get the family. So there's this massive caravan of camels and wagons full of the best of Egypt, and they're sent to Canaan to gather Joseph and convince Jacob to come to see his son Joseph, and here's all the stuff that Joseph can provide for you now. And everyone comes into Egypt in honor. Joseph's brothers are given an audience with Pharaoh. Jacob, Joseph's father, is given an audience with Pharaoh and is actually asked to bless Pharaoh, as if the man needed any blessings, the way that Joseph's been hauling all in. Pharaoh responds by giving them the best land in Egypt. And this is really they're the upper echelon of society. This is Joseph's family. Now, as they come into Egypt, Egypt is an amazing place. Egypt is a land that is irrigated by the Nile River. It's a land of massive temples, all the best that the city has to offer as we think about it today. Now, we all live in a place because we don't think that has that much to offer. But for the Israelites going into Egypt, they were just amazed. Egypt was an amazing place. But it is never supposed to be home for the Israelites. As Jacob's life nears its end, he calls in all of his sons. He gives them blessings. Well, sometimes it's blessings. Sometimes he's calling them out for the stuff that they did that they didn't think he knew that they did. But he makes Joseph promise to take his bones back to Canaan. He says, "Don't bury me here in Egypt. Take me back to where my father and my grandfather are buried. Bury me there." So after Jacob's death, there's 70 days of mourning in Egypt. I want you to think about that. 70 days to mourn not Pharaoh, not even Joseph, but the father of Joseph. 70 days of mourning. And then there's a huge funeral procession all the way back to Canaan. In fact, Joseph and his brothers go back, and then a bunch of dignitaries from Egypt go back. There's so many people that gathered there for this funeral that the Canaanites in the surrounding land gave the place a new name, because all of the Egyptians came to mourn whoever this person was. And after the mourning, after the 70 days of mourning, Joseph's brothers started to get worried. Wait a second. We did some pretty rotten stuff to our brother. What if he now decides to get vengeance? If Joseph wanted to destroy his brothers, there is absolutely nothing that they could do to stop him. He was in charge of all of Egypt's armies. The only claim that Joseph's brothers had to anything in Egypt was through their brother. He could put them all in prison. He could order them all killed and not a problem, it would be done. He could withhold food from them. He could say, go back to where you came from, knowing that there's no food there. They could not survive on their own. Joseph is in a pretty powerful position here. And his brothers start to get really scared. They couldn't protect themselves or their families. They were completely at the mercy of their brother, who they had done some pretty rotten stuff to. So if you have your Bibles, you can open them up with us to Genesis chapter 50, starting with verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." And when the message came to him, Joseph wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. There's a comedian that has a set about "It's What Daddy Would Have Wanted." It's a redneck comedian. You may know who I'm talking about. But he talks about how they do funerals, and then after the funeral, they say, after the funeral's over, I'm going to go back home and I'm going to get that grandfather clock out of the corner and this and that from the house, because that's what Daddy would have wanted. And the response is, no, Daddy would have wanted you to pay the money back to Mama that you owe her and not take all of her stuff. But there's this sense after Jacob's death that the brothers get scared and they start this, "It's what Daddy would have wanted," as they try to convince their brother to not hurt them. They send a message that is purported to be from Jacob. Now, the text doesn't tell us whether it really was or whether it really wasn't. There's no evidence that it's genuine. There's no evidence that it's faked. It's just they sent a letter saying it was from their daddy. This is what Daddy would have wanted. But there's no evidence in the text that Jacob actually learned that his son sold Joseph into slavery. Quite honestly, if that would have been the case, if Jacob would have known what happened to Joseph and how they deceived him, that probably would have factored into his final blessing that we read, because he didn't hold anything back. When his sons did something wrong, he called them out for it. He did not call them out for selling their brother into slavery, which means that they probably never told him what happened. Jacob probably never knew. This grieves Joseph deeply. It grieves him because he's already given up on that concept of revenge. If he wanted revenge against his brothers, he knew he could have enacted that revenge the very first time that they came to Egypt to buy food. He thought about it. He threw them in jail for 3 days. We know he was thinking about it. And he's grieved that after all of these years, after all the ways that he's taken care of them, all the ways that he's tried to show them it's okay, they're grieved, or they're concerned, they're worried. And so Joseph wept. But they don't even give him time to respond to the letter. They're worried. They show up at his door, throw themselves down on the ground and say, "We're your slaves." He's like, "No, you're not. You're my brothers." Now, here's the interesting part of this story. The reason that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery was because he was a dreamer and they didn't like his dreams. You remember what his dreams were? About his brothers bowing down before him. Here they are. The dream is fulfilled in this moment. It's not the first time the dream's been fulfilled. They bowed down before him when they came for food. They didn't know who he was then, but they bowed down before him. And then when Dad came and the whole family came, they all bowed down before Joseph because look at what this man has done. The text doesn't acknowledge the dream at this moment, but it's very clear that this is the dream coming true. They know who Joseph is, and they bow down before him. They pledge themselves as his slaves. And once again, as he did in chapter 45, he says, get up. You're my brothers, and I'm going to take care of you. He reminds them that there's a bigger picture at work here. And he reassures his brothers, that you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now I don't know if Benjamin came to be a part of this bowing down before. That was Joseph's brother by the same mother versus his brothers by other mothers. I don't know if Benjamin was there or not because Benjamin really hadn't wronged Joseph the way that the others had. But there were 10 or 11 of his brothers bowing down before him. And Joseph is thinking, you think this is all about you? This is not all about you. You're not the only 11 lives that were saved because of me being in Egypt in the time that I was. Understand that all of Egypt was saved because of Joseph being there at the right time. And not only all of Egypt, but much of Canaan, much of the surrounding nations came to get food from Egypt because they're the only ones that had it. And Joseph is thinking, you still think this is all about you? This isn't about you. This is about what God has done to save many lives, even though you had bad intentions. And Joseph responds by saying, I'm going to take care of you. It's all right. You don't have to worry. I'm not going to kill you off. I'm not going to hurt your families. I'm going to take care of you and your descendants as long as I'm able. Because Joseph saw the bigger picture of what God was doing. Now, Joseph had worked with other nations. We know that he worked with those from Canaan. There were people from all over that area of the world that were coming for food. And he had watched as nations and as people gave up everything that they had for food. The Egyptian people enslaved themselves willingly to Pharaoh for food. They sold all of their land, they sold all of their livestock, they sold themselves for food. Joseph knew what had happened. And he knew that his position had protected his family. You know what his family lost in this famine? Nothing. He even gave them back the silver that they paid for the food the first 2 times that they came to Egypt. His family lost nothing in this famine. They gained a whole lot. He put them in a position where they could be better off than anybody else. He had protected them. Had his brothers not sold him, they would have starved. Had they not had their wicked plan, Joseph would have starved with them. His brothers had intended harm, but God was working in amazing ways to accomplish his purposes, even in the midst of the pain and the stupidity of his brothers. Could God have worked differently? Absolutely. Do I wish God would have worked differently? Absolutely. Because this is a messy story to preach through. But the message here, loud and clear, is that God can work in messy situations to bring about his purposes, even when it seems like people are really making stupid decisions. Yeah, there's a lot of amens. We all look at our own lives and we see that. There are a lot of lessons that this passage can teach us. In fact, I really struggled trying to say, okay, what's the point of this passage? And I just went with probably the shortest section of Scripture that I've gone with the entire book of Genesis. But there's so many lessons here. A lot more than we can cover today. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, it's this, and that may be what God is speaking to you, and I may not mention that, and that's okay. Listen to God, not to me. But let's look at a few of these lessons. First of all, there's a bigger picture at work here than what anybody in the story realized. It was bigger than what Joseph could see. It was bigger than what his brothers could see. This was a big picture. Only God could understand the whole picture of what God was doing in this story. Now, Jim, you and I had the privilege of having lunch on Friday. And one of the things that I walk away from every conversation from you or with you is I feel like I'm reminded of the bigger picture of what God is doing in this valley. Hearing your story all the way back to the 60s, from when you first drove through and said this would be a good place to pastor a church, to the way that God called you here from Seattle, and the way that you were able to minister in this valley. And now, even though things have been kind of crazy for this church since you left, I'm reminded every time that we talk about the bigger picture of what God is doing in this valley, and specifically in this church. I can't grasp that on my own. I don't think you can grasp that on your own. But it's a reminder to us that God is doing something here. There's a bigger picture going on than what we realize in this world. There's also a very powerful message here on forgiveness versus revenge. Now, we live in a society that does not like this message. Movies are full of scenes of people getting revenge. That's the point of many of the movies that we watch. And this is one of those situations that would have been the perfect narrative for Joseph to come in and crush his brothers based on what they did to him. Joseph had the power to exact revenge on his brothers in a way that would have gone down in history. He saved the Egyptians. He could have obliterated his own family. And at this point in the narrative, Dad's not around to say what Daddy would have wanted. And Joseph has complete control. He would have been justified in his decision. They deserved it. They sold their own brother into slavery. They nearly killed their father with grief by making him think that Joseph had been eaten by a wild animal in a mission that Jacob sent Joseph to do. Can you imagine the guilt that Jacob felt for sending Joseph, his beloved favorite son, to go check on his brothers? And in accomplishing that mission, Jacob killed his son. That grief nearly killed him. He would not be comforted. His brothers deserved, as I grew up hearing, to be taken behind the woodshed. Joseph would have been justified in his decision, whatever he decided to do. But he chose to forgive. He chose to say, God's at work in this story. And it's bigger than me. They deserve it, but I'm going to forgive. That's a message that some of us need to hear. And then there's the whole guilt versus the dream. Joseph's brothers couldn't see the dream. They forgot the dream that their brother had that caused them to sell him into slavery. They only felt their own guilt. Every time that we see the brothers in this story, they're feeling guilty. When they're coming to Joseph for food, and they're talking in Hebrew and don't know that he can understand them, they're saying, the punishment that we're receiving is because of what we did to our brothers. They lived with that guilt day in, day out. They knew they had messed up. They felt guilty for their actions. These actions plagued them for many, many years. Even though they were fulfilling the dream by bowing down in front of their brothers, all they could see was their own guilt. I think sometimes for us, we can get so consumed with our own guilt over the messes that we've made that we forget what God is doing right around us. This is something I struggle with, because my story is full of areas where I've messed up. My story is full of instances where I've made stupid decisions, arrogant decisions. I've pushed to get my way, and I was so consumed with getting my way, I wouldn't listen to anybody telling me that the way that I was seeking was just stupid. I was making big mistakes. My story is full of those instances where I wouldn't listen to anybody until it was too late, and the message I was then hearing was, I tried to tell you. And so I deal with that a lot, where I'm in a situation and it's like, man, I deserve this. I messed up. This is a direct result of what I did. And every time God will come through in some way, whether it's through a song or through something that I'm reading, and He'll remind me, Emmanuel, it's not about the mistake that you made. It's about what I want to do. Will you let me work in your life? I know you messed up, but I'm still working. So some of us need to hear this message, to let go of the guilt and the shame and say, God, what do you want to do? And help me to keep my eyes on what you're doing instead of what I've done. One of the things that hit me in this story, and I wrestle with this a little bit theologically, was the reality that Joseph's brothers probably thought too highly of their own abilities. They thought that they were messing up God's plan by selling their brother. I agree it wasn't a very good thing to do. And I agree that God would have worked in some other way had they not done it. But they arrogantly thought that they had messed up what God was doing. And here they're reminded that God can and does work even in the messiest of situations. These are all important lessons. It's important lessons for those who were a part of the Exodus experience as they were coming out of slavery. They needed to hear this story. They knew the story of Joseph, but they needed to hear these words as quoted from Joseph's mouth. You intended to harm me. In other words, you intentionally messed up. But God is using it for good. They needed to remember that their God was working in the messes. Remember the Egyptian gods that they had built temples for in their slavery were gods that had to be pacified, usually with alcohol. That was the number one sacrifice of the Egyptians to their gods. In other words, the religious system they were a part of said, keep the gods drunk so they don't get angry with us. And yet, the story of Joseph reminds us not of a God who needs to be kept drunk so he doesn't do something that he'll regret, but of a God who works in the middle of the messes, the messiest of situations, even making a golden calf and saying, this is the calf that brought us out of Egypt. God can work in their messes. And they needed to see their dream, not the guilt. They needed to see the dream that God had given to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob of the land that he was going to give them, and that through that land they were going to be a blessing to all nations of the earth. That was their dream. That was their purpose. And they were consumed with their guilt. And they needed to be reminded of the dream, not their guilt. We've also talked about the fact that this story was probably compiled in the version that we have it today in a time when the Israelites had lost everything that they had and were hauled off into exile. They were hauled off to Babylon or to Assyria, and they were enslaved in some ways, but the Babylonians were trying to get them to not be Jews anymore and trying to get them to just blend in with everybody else. And they needed this story. And they needed to know how to use this story in the lives that they were living. One example of a young man who probably wrestled with this concept of revenge versus forgiveness is a young man named Daniel. We hear about Daniel. There's a book written about Daniel and how he was an advisor to the king. Now, I can tell you that if a foreign country comes and conquers the United States and then tries to make me an advisor to the king, I'm going to do absolutely everything in my power to usurp and try to destroy that nation because I have that streak in me. Daniel needed to be reminded of this message of forgiveness, not revenge, as he's giving counsel to the kings. They're trying to understand their story from the perspective of being in exile. How do you handle the people who wronged you? Well, let's talk about how Joseph handled his brothers who wronged him. They need to remember that God can work in their messes too. Now, these are all important lessons. And I think when we think about these lessons, and again, I know that there are more here than I covered, I think there's probably something here that applies to everyone in this room. We all have something in this story that we need to think about. Some of us need to be reminded that there's a bigger picture than the immediate thing that we see in front of our face. This week, that was my biggest struggle, is that bigger picture, not just what I'm facing straight on. Some of us need to be reminded to choose forgiveness rather than revenge. It's not just a message that we see with Joseph, it's a message that we see Jesus live out over and over. It's a message that we see Paul preach and live out. Some of us need to be reminded to forgive. Some of us need to be reminded to keep our eyes on the dream that God has given rather than the guilt of the messes that we've made in the past. And some of us need to be reminded that God can work through us or in spite of us. But God is going to accomplish his purposes. So I don't know what you need to hear this morning. As the worship team comes and as we prepare to close, we're going to do Waiting Here for You again. I don't know what God wants to speak to you. But I know that these are messages these are lessons that can help us in the realities of this life. I know that we live in a culture where we are really good at blaming everybody else for what's going on in the world around us. There's a lot of that this week. There's a lot of arguments about Afghanistan. We'll just use that as one example. Shouldn't have pulled out. Others say we shouldn't have gone in. We can argue, we can point fingers, we can say that this is wrong, and I agree that it's wrong. What's happening to our brothers and sisters is wrong. But it's easy for us to get so caught up in where we can point fingers instead of being where we need to be, which is down on our knees for our brothers and sisters. This is not a matter of saying, how can I blame others? There are mistakes made. How can we offer forgiveness? How can we see that there's a bigger picture than what we can see? How can we be reminded that God can work through us or God can work in spite of us, but God is working. And it doesn't always make sense, but there's a bigger picture involved. So let's wait for him. Let's ask him what he would speak to us today.